Welcome to the Bleep Bulimia podcast with guest Clint Malley, mental health educator. Hi everyone, I am Lorianne. I am the host of Bleep Bulimia, and today I have Clint Malley with me. He is a mental health educator. I do have to say this, he's also a master's level educator. So we're going to be speaking about all this because I really want to know your story, Clint. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Lorianne, for having me. I'm excited to chat with you.
Thank you. So as I like to know is what is your story behind all of this, becoming a mental health educator and also the master's level educator? That's really interesting.
Yeah, so I was formerly a language arts teacher for high school and then for middle school. And I taught in the Old Fourth Ward of Atlanta. So, a really diverse group of kids from all different backgrounds. And by the way, teaching was the hardest job I've ever done in my whole life. There is nothing harder than teaching. Um, it challenges you on every level, mentally, emotionally, physically. It is a difficult job. And I realized that I really liked being able to break down concepts or lessons into like simple step by step things for students. But what I didn't like was that everything was about test orientation culture. And I saw that there was a huge gap for social and emotional learning within for students in the classroom. Like so much of what you do as a teacher is really just behavior modification or just trying to help kids control their bodies, regulate their emotions, that kind of thing. And I realized I had no training on that. I'd spent, my master's was in teaching, but they teach you nothing about how to help students regulate their emotions, to process their feelings, to work with others. It's all about the content. It's all about the standards. And at the same time, towards, around the fifth year of me teaching, I had a brother who passed away from an overdose of heroin. And so I was convinced that part of my journey needed to be in helping to educate kids in their social emotional learning and helping them to overcome addictions because that was kind of like at the underlying root of my brother's challenges was mental health. And as the underlying root for most addictions that we know, it's usually a dual diagnosis, meaning that there's some underlying mental health challenge that someone's going through, and the addiction is a way to be able to cope with that. And so I started working for a company called Sandstone Care, which specifically works with teens and young adults for mental health and substance use. And a big part of my job is just being a mental health communicator. So trying to reach out to young adults to communicate with them in a way that they can understand, to teens in a way that they can understand. And there's actually a lot of similarities. What we're finding is that there's a lot of adults who don't know the basics of this kind of psychoeducation. And so I'm happy to join all kinds of communities to be able to talk about these things because we all know kids who need mental health support. And chances are, when we were a kid, there were some underlying things that we didn't get met with as a kid. So that's why I'm here today.
Well, that just gave me goosebumps because in all fairness, I wish you had been there when I was, you're a lot younger than me, but you were um when I was 17, 18, going through this transition of becoming bulimic. There was nobody there. And you're absolutely right. And that's really an interesting concept that I really never thought about. I mean, my sister is a teacher as well, and she's very nurturing by, you know, she was born with it. But you're right, when you're being taught to be a teacher, you're not being taught really all of that. Um, and I think that young adults, yeah, I was a young adult when I started it, and then we carry that through. I mean, it was 30 years I carried this young adulthood with me. So it starts at an early stage, but you're right, you can still reach out to the ones that are adults that are still struggling with it, knowing even that it quite often started earlier and it just has not
Mm.
been taken care of, right? And people don't know who to turn to sometimes about that. And of course, in bulimia's pretty well actually any addiction, right? It's the shame of reaching out and saying, "Hey, I've got a problem." I need
Yeah.
to
And you
address.
absolutely. And you brought up like a really interesting point that a lot you could, if you look back at your own story in your own life, you can see instances or points where you could have gone one way or another.
Mhm.
And it started when you were younger. And so, oftentimes, even when we're adults, a big part of our own healing journey is going back and tracing back our steps to saying, what happened here that made me choose this direction versus another direction? And we were
Mhm.
talking before we started recording, and you were like, oh, I wish I would have done this differently because life is so much better now. But at the end of the day, when we're kids, especially, we only know the context that we grow up in, right?
Mhm.
We only have our family to look to say, is this a normal family? Is this not a normal family? And so much of what we believe is normal is just the context that we grow up in. It's not until we are more independent that we can start seeing, oh, maybe some stuff wasn't right. Maybe I learned some wrong things along the way. But it's really when we're going into the therapeutic relationship or when we're going into our own minds trying to understand how addiction or how bulimia or how any type of eating disorder develops, oftentimes we're finding that it stems from earlier childhood experiences.
Yeah. Uh, Interesting story. I know this is going to sound really strange, but I was watching a little bit about one of the actors that I like, and it was saying that he moved around, his parents moved around a lot, and that became an issue of disengaging yourself and so on, because you had to always make new friends. And it was something that my mother talked about because we moved around a lot as kids. My dad, that was his job, was to move. Um and you're talking about childhood, and I wonder sometimes if that was one of the things, but the things you never really know if that's one of the things. Does that make any sense to you? Like, I'm going, did that
Yeah.
affect me? Like, was that because
Yeah.
obviously it does affect a child if you're moved around a lot. But I know people who stay the same place are also affected by things too. But it is, you're constantly having to make new friends and leave old friends. Um, but
Yeah.
again, I just sit there and go, but was that really something that bothered me? Because I can't feel it.
Mm.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I think when we have a supportive family structure in the way we grow up, we're actually really resilient. Kids can adapt
Yeah.
really well to change if they have a supportive family structure. But when there's not that support or when there's uncertainty, they call it, when we think about the attachment styles, there's four different attachment styles for kids. Um, we have an anxious attachment style, we have an avoidant attachment style, we have a anxious avoidant attachment style, and then we have a safe attachment style, right? And the anxious attachment style has to do with an inconsistency within the caregiver and the child relationship, meaning that sometimes when you needed your parents, they weren't there. And all parents know, if you're a parent, you know that there's going to be times where you mess things up. That's a human life. But for
Totally.
very key things, right? And on a consistent ongoing basis, there's a pattern of needing your parent to help you regulate your emotions. We learn to regulate our emotions through our parents first, right? We see the way that they handle trouble or conflict, the way they calm themselves down. That's how we first learn how to calm ourselves down, right? And if that wasn't the case, if that was an inconsistent thing within our own life, then we grow up with this feeling of like, I'm not sure if the people who love me are going to stay around and be there for me, right? And so a moving can be a big deal when you're a little kid and you're not sure if your parents are going to be there for you, and you've built up these strong relationships with friends at a school, and then you move again, it seems like you can't win, right? And so our relationships are a key part of that. And depending on how you grow up, it can impact the way that you interact with the world and how you interact with future relationships as well. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. You know what? Absolutely. It's actually interesting. I get these little goosebumps thinking about that. Yeah, and I would imagine that different children would respond different ways. I mean, the more introvert or the more extrovert, or so on and so forth. But yeah, it was interesting. But I would, yeah, I like I said, it's weird though, because those are things that I would think that speaking to someone would probably uh, make you feel more, whether that might be something. Because like I said, I listened to one of your podcasts, which was really, really, really neat, in regards to trauma and the left brain and the right brain and the eyes going on that. And I'm thinking, I've never, I've taken therapy and stuff like that because of my bulimia, but this was a deeper niche of what you can go through in
Hmm.
realizing what your right brain is doing that your left brain is not aware of.
Yeah, you want to unpack that for your listeners a little bit? Can we talk about that?
Please talk about that because that
Okay.
was really, really to me fascinating.
Yeah, so when you experience a trauma, and we have to kind of expand what we understand as the definition of trauma, because
Mhm,
people tend to think about trauma as an accident, a natural disaster, a near-death experience, and they often call that big T trauma. But a more common type of trauma is chronic trauma, right? And
mhm,
that means that something has been happening in your life on an ongoing basis that increases your stress levels, right? And when you're a kid, it's usually some part of the either neglect, abuse, which stems from sexual abuse, then physical abuse, then emotional abuse, right? Or we see domestic violence. We're witnesses to that kind of thing. So trauma has a big definition, but the key thing to remember about trauma is that when you experience trauma, you experience it in the right side of your brain, which is the same way that we experience our five senses, right? Sight, smell, touch, hearing, taste, right? And so as you go throughout your life, you'll encounter things that will trigger you. You've heard of this is triggering.
mhm.
And it triggers you on a sensory level, meaning you see something and it triggers you to an earlier trauma that you experienced, or even if you smell something or you taste something, it can trigger you. And so oftentimes when we're going throughout this our life, we don't even realize that we've experienced a trauma because our normal is our own normal and we don't know what to compare it to sometimes. Like I only understood that my upbringing was not normal when I went to my friend's house or when I saw things on TV or when I watched, movies. I was like, oh man, that's not like my life, right? And so as you go throughout your life, you're going to experience these things and you're going to feel it in your body first. You're going to feel these sensations happening in your body first. And they can be great clues to helping you understand and retrace your steps of why does my stomach feel nauseated when I see this thing? Or why is it when I hear this sound that I feel scared and want to like clam up? So it can be the breadcrumbs that kind of lead us back to original traumas that might have started like a mental health challenge or an addiction in the first place.
Now, I have a really interesting question. Would it be possible? Because I said that like you, I understand that, and it could be little tiny traumas that build up into, like you said, over time, and not even like abuse, even feeling like bullied at school or whatever the case, not feeling, and they all add up. Uh, but here's something that I find interesting is that the other day, like actually yesterday, I went to work. Okay. My daughter's really cute. She goes, she has the weekend anxiety of going back to work. So she'll be off on a weekend and gets anxiety about going back to work. I thought that was really interesting because I got that too. I'm not as bad now because I love my job, but the other one I did. And I'm just, I'm sure my listeners would be sitting there going, really? Remember, you're not alone. People will say things you think you're weird, but you're not. It actually happens. But on Monday, I get to work and my stomach's in knots, and I hadn't had that anxiety feeling in the longest time. But the most disturbing thing is I couldn't figure out why.
Mm.
literally sat there because usually I'm acutely aware of my issues, but I could not. And I told my friends, I said, yeah, I said, don't mind me, I'm off today. I'm dealing with anxiety and I have no clue why. Nothing.
Mhm.
Is that
Yeah.
normal?
So there's a term for it. It's called the Sunday scaries, meaning
Oh, is it?
that it's a phenomenon. So yeah, you're not weird. This is a really common thing. So, and it really doesn't have to be Sunday, but it can be any day before you go back into work in your break time, right? So let's think about this. And what kind of work are you involved in again?
Well, I am in the automotive industry. I actually, the greatest position, when people buy their car, I'm the one who they come in, they do the paperwork with me, and I go through all the stuff with them. So they're excited because I teach them all the technology. So it's a fun job. It's super fun.
Okay. So you
Yeah.
normally have pretty positive interactions with customers
Yeah.
because they're happy because they've already made the purchase. You're not the one having to sell it. There's not any
Mhm.
anxiety with that. Um, Question, is there any part of your job that's challenging?
Um, not,
Another way
I
to
would,
say it, is there any part of your job that is outside of your control that you have to deal with?
not really. Not really. I think where I would say that there is something out of my control is my relationships with my children.
Mm,
And I think that on a Sunday I had some news and maybe I carried that into work with me. Would
mm.
that would be, could you do that? Like, does that do that?
Yeah, yeah. So
And
like,
you haven't had the time to digest, that, well, I had two children that went through a tough time on Sunday, two of them.
mhm, of
And well, they're adult children, but they're still my children. But I think that I
course.
couldn't completely digest everything that was going on. So I just ended up, I think I brought it to work with me. I think that's what I did. Because I think that's what was
Yeah.
bothering me. This work really, I have nothing that bothers me there and nothing that is feels like a challenge. I mean, everything's a challenge because if it wasn't, it wouldn't be fun, but I'm saying nothing that I can't handle. But yeah, I think it was that I brought to work with me.
Yeah. And when you go to work, we have this idea with work that we have our work selves and we have our
Mhm.
home selves.
Yes.
And that when we cross the threshold, we have to turn our work self on and our home self has to be turned off. And
Yes.
so if we're dealing with something at home, we cannot bring this. But humans are kind of messy, aren't they? It doesn't really work that way. It doesn't, there's not a part of our brain where we can just dissociate and disconnect from Sunday to Monday. And so if you feel like there's a lack of closure and you feel like you have to be your work self coming in, where you're happy, where your customers are everything, and where you're putting on a good face, your body is going to tell on you. Your body's
Mhm.
going to say, actually, this doesn't feel good. I feel stressed. Like, I don't feel like there's closure with my kids. And the thought of me trying to act another way other than I feel right now feels really hard. And I feel overwhelmed about that, even though your job itself is not particularly stressful.
That's a really good point. You know what? That is perfectly explained. And now I'm going to go into the bulimia. I think that actually has a lot to do with it too, where there's no closure and I would think mental health does that, right? Like you said, I felt it in my stomach and it was bothering me in my head because I could feel it in my body and my head knows there's something wrong. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, uh, very, very good point. Very good point. So when you're helping your clients, how do you go about doing that? I mean, obviously there's no one set way because everybody's different, but what's your philosophy on this whole thing?
Yeah, so within behavioral health, and when we say behavioral health, we mean the combination of mental health or addiction support or substance use support. Within mental health, there's a term called biopsychosocial care. And it's like a three-legged stool, meaning that if you take out any of those three parts, the bio part, the psycho part, or the social part, it's going to tip over, right? And so if you are committed to somebody getting the best support possible and having the biggest likelihood of long-term recovery, then you want them to have what's called biopsychosocial support. And I was thinking maybe we can just unpack it from the top, right? What each one of those means. Would that
Please
work?
do. Absolutely. Yes. Because that fascinated me too. Please do.
Okay, so the first part is bio or biological care. And we know this that if somebody is hungry, somebody is tired, or somebody doesn't feel safe, then it does not matter how gifted a therapist is or how perfect a therapeutic regimen is or how supportive other people are, it will be very difficult for them to engage in the process, right? So of healing. And so with bulimia, this becomes a huge factor because one of those things that, and probably two of those, safety and hunger, are the preventing things that allow somebody to engage. We know when we think about cults and we think about brainwashing practices that cults do, hunger is a huge part of it because it increases our susceptibility and allows us to be able to be more malleable to a cult leader. And so sleep deprivation and hunger deprivation or food deprivation are a big part of that kind of treatment of an individual to make them palatable to change or to influence. And so think about it from your own cognitive distortions, or meaning the lies that you tell yourself, right? It becomes a really challenging cycle to break out of. If I'm hungry, I'm more susceptible to believing lies. Simple, right? And if I'm more susceptible to believing lies, then it becomes challenging to be able to break out of that. That's the first thing. And it's the foundation of which all other health is kind of founded. If I'm hungry, if I'm tired, or if I don't feel safe, I'm not going to be able to grow mentally or physically. We see that in nature everywhere. So sometimes with biological care, we see this with, okay, detox, right? So with substance use, the first thing is to get the substance out of somebody's system, right? And if somebody's been with a stimulant like meth or heroin, the first thing they need to do is just sleep a ton, right?
Yeah.
And then when it comes to like other substances like alcohol and benzodiazepines, they need medication in order to be able to help them out. And with some other harder substances like fentanyl, they need different medication to be able to help reduce cravings or to make people feel satiated. Or if somebody does use that, it doesn't release the same dopamine triggers within their brain. All of that fits under the umbrella of biological care. It's making a client feel safe. It's making sure that the basic needs of food and sleep and shelter are all taken care of, because that's the foundation for physical health or for mental health, is to make sure that this person has a basic physical health. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
The
Well,
second
that's
part is, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say that's very interesting. It's absolutely true too. And a lot of us, I think one of the things that I've deprived myself of mostly, not food, um, has been sleep. Like sleep, I think we really do ignore how important sleep is to our lives. So,
Mm,
all right,
yeah.
move on to the next one.
Yeah, just one more thing on that.
Yeah,
There's an acronym called HALT, HALT, and it
yeah,
means hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And oftentimes, if somebody's in a triggering situation and they're feeling like they want to use again, or they're feeling like they want to binge or purge or any of those things, right? it comes down to somebody being hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. There are basic physical things that kind of make us more susceptible to that. So it's a helpful thing to remember when you're trying to understand your own triggers is HALT.
And halt and
Um,
stop and think about it.
yep.
I love it. I love
Absolutely.
it. Thank you.
Okay, so the second component is psychological or psycho care. And this has to do with the patterns of thinking that we develop, right? Most of us learn some sort of coping mechanism, meaning a way that we control our negative emotion, first from the people around us in our family. And then over time, as we do that coping mechanism enough, it becomes an ingrained part of our personality and the way that we solve problems. So humans from the beginning of time have encountered change, right? Bad weather or hunger or boredom, and they've created things to be able to control that change, right? Whether that's shelter or clothing or painting, so I can paint on my cave, or government, so I can control the people around. We live in a world of change and control, right? And our psychological makeup, the patterns of thinking that we develop over time, we don't do these patterns of thinking because we're dumb or because we don't know what's right. We do them because they've worked, at least on some level, right? They've helped us survive in the world. And it's important to remember that because people will beat themselves up about it. We were talking earlier on the show, like, why did I do all of these things in my past? Why did I handle problems and challenges and change in such a destructive way? Like, what was I thinking? Didn't I know? And the truth is that every way that we've learned to be able to solve or to cope with change is because on some level it helped us survive and it worked, right?
It's so weird. Sorry, I had a psychiatrist who told me that. He said, bulimia is a slow suicide, but it's a slow one. He says, you're probably still alive today because of it. I know
Mm,
that's a weird thing for him to say, but I understood what he was saying. The alternative wouldn't have been a nice thing.
mm. So maybe we can connect it to you if you're open to it. About when you think about your own journey with
Yeah.
bulimia, what were the things you were telling yourself, the patterns of thinking? What did bulimia help you control in your life that was a hard thing for you to deal with? What feelings did it help you control?
Being controlled,
Okay, say
being
more.
feeling like I wasn't, I loved my life. I loved everything about it, but I just felt it wasn't even, it was like, so bulimia is sort of like it's controlling your weight and not showing people that you have this, weakness to food, right? So it helped to mask your weakness to your food consumption. Um, but it was like I was always trying to achieve, to be perfect, to be what I I should be. I was definitely not the perfect mother, but I wanted to be the perfect mother. I wanted to be a perfect wife. Definitely was not the perfect wife. I mean, all of these things, it doesn't matter how hard you try, you're never going to be perfect at anything. And the other thing too is with bulimia, it changes your mood so that you become a little bit, more short tempered. If you can't have your food and hide and do it, and you just like get upset. So that made it even worse of everything I was trying to make perfect in my life. It was making it worse, but I was controlling my weight because I felt like the world was controlling me. And yet it was
Mm,
my perspective because I felt I had to prove to the world, to my parents, to my husband, to my kids, to everybody that I was this, successful, wonderful wife, husband, like mother, all of this. And and volunteer and all of that. And it just was so over consuming that hello food was not over consuming. It was just like a place to hide is what it was.
mm, yeah. I mean, you touched on a lot of really important themes, right? You felt like one, that the world that you were in was chaotic and not always within your control.
Yeah.
Two, food was something that you could control.
Yeah.
And three, that the appearance or your weight was a way to outwardly show that you were in control,
Yes,
right? And so
definitely.
you had all of these different things. I can't control the world. I can control my food. If I can be this weight, then people will think I'm in control, even if I'm not, right?
Mhm.
And that is a pattern of thinking. And you, with your experience over, the last 14 years, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, with the last
I
14
smile a
years, she
lot
says
because
it
I'm
with a
really excited
smile.
about
Yeah.
that. Yay!
The last 14 years, you're able to look back, and to you, it seems really clear that this is the case. But the challenge is that when you're in it, it becomes really, really hard.
Mhm.
Just like we learn how to co-regulate our emotions from our caregivers, we also need to work with others to be able to unpack and understand our patterns of thinking because it's really challenging to do this on your own.
Mhm.
So when you're a baby and you cry, your parents, they pick you up and they hold you, and you are all, we know from studies that babies are watching their parents' faces. And if their parents look distressed, then they become distressed. If the parents are calm, then they're calm. If their heartbeat is fast, the baby's heart rate will increase. If the breathing is fast, the baby's breathing will increase. And we come into this world regulating or co regulating our emotions with our caregivers, right? And it's up to our caregivers to teach us how to calm down. They teach us the positive way to be able to sort through our emotions. Now, as a baby, it's really simple. As a baby, and this goes into the next part, which is social care, because it has to do with our relationships to others. But as we grow up, our problems become more complex, but our need for people in our life to teach us positive coping skills or ways to deal with change doesn't change. We still need to have human beings demonstrate for us a way to be able to encounter challenging emotions and to process it in a happy and healthy way, right? So whether that's talking, a key part of is it expressing our feelings. We have irreducible needs as kids. One of those is the ability to express our emotions without fear of punishment. So if you grew up in a society or in a culture that when you were frustrated or angry, they put you in timeout or they isolated you, or when you cried, you were a guy and they told you to, don't cry, guys don't cry, then you grow up without the ability to understand how to process your emotions in a healthy way. And that those patterns of thinking, they never leave us, right? And so after we have identified safety and we are not hungry and we have enough sleep and we've worked with people to help us understand our patterns of thinking, we then have to work with other people, sometimes a therapist, sometimes in groups, oftentimes a supportive community like the one that you're building here, in which you're able to say, how do we do things differently? Because we've been doing it this way, and we now need to change the way that we're encountering change. And we don't do that alone. As humans, we grew and we learned to adapt as a culture by working together, by foraging, by hunting, but everything was together. If you were outside of a tribe, you were as good as dead because when you were asleep, danger could come, right? You can't procreate by yourself. You can't have safety, that key thing that we talked about earlier in the biological care, if we don't have any numbers. And so, coming back to this biopsychosocial care, we need a community of people to help us to learn new ways to deal with change and to learn more positive things to control in our life or to recognize the things that are outside of our control. So, that's, I mean, in a nutshell, that's biopsychosocial care. And that's the things that we try to do with teens and young adults at Sandstone Care is to help them from that ground up approach.
It's really smart. It's yeah, it's interesting. Okay, so when I was gonna say with me with the crying, it was like go to your room.
Hmm.
Right. I maybe that's why I like, you know, uh, okay, I'm an introvert extrovert. I love my job, love being with people, but when I get home, I don't want to talk to anyone. I just want to be with my
Hmm.
dogs and just like shut everything off, right? But so that was kind of funny when I thought about that. I loved being on my own. I still do. I have no problem being on my own. Um, there was something else that you brought up, and now it's just lost on this one. Um, oh, the tribe and the caring. I think that one thing that our society has done, and particularly women, and I would say that, and it's weird to say my generation. I mean, it was the generation before me as well. Um, so I'm kind of like a line of a boomer Gen Xer, but the boomers and then the Gen Xers, women just all of a sudden it was like, I'm going to become independent, right? The late boomers, right? Um, and that independence that my daughter still has it, so not just so it's been passed down, being independent and not wanting to ask for help. And I think that that is difficult. You want to do it all by yourself, you don't want to ask for help, you're going to do it. And not just women, men too. But I know, like, even when I lost my business, I mean, my parents, they were there, they had a home. No, I went and lived in a barn for 3 years because I didn't want to, I'm doing
Mm.
this on my own. Right. um and you were saying about asking for help and having that tribe there. It's something I think that over the generations has really broken out, right? And people are living in different areas of the world. The parents are here and the child is there. It used to be that it was a community, and it's not as much today. Um, do you feel that that can cause some of the pressure of and like I said, in the independence people, that the children wanting to be independent so much that it's they're afraid to even ask for help. Like,
Mm.
sorry, that was a kind of a little big long thing, but I know that that
Yeah.
was my issues, my pride, right? I'm independent. I can do this,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So there's unique and different challenges with every generation. When I was a teacher, one of the things that you would often hear other teachers say is that when I was a teacher, it was this way, and now, these students don't understand this, right? And so it's called like in psychology, we call it like the golden age principle. And every generation looks back at their upbringing and they idealize it, right? Our memories are very fluid things. And we tend to remember things as like the positive attributes about it. But if we think about the boomer generation, right, we learned what PTSD was after Vietnam, right?
Yeah.
We saw great activism culture happening in the 60s and 70s, and people standing up for their rights and people connecting and people being able to do things. And we also saw very stringent gender norms, right?
Yes.
People being put into a box and people saying, like, oh, you want to have a career and a family? No, that's not possible. Or you want to express yourself as this way? Well, that's not possible. That's not something. So there's complexities within every generation. And within this generation, in one way, we're more connected than ever. Right. So I was around for the transition of the invention of the internet, right? Where we didn't have cell phones and then we did have cell phones. We didn't have the internet and then we did have the internet. And one of the things that we have now is that even though we have more connection through technology, we struggle to connect in person. I was just at a dinner with my family the other day, and there was a bunch of women with headphones in, and he was just glued to it the whole time, right? Because at the dinner table, and it's because like they were obviously there for like he was probably 11 years old. They're obviously there for a celebration of some sort, right?
Mm.
And the assumption is the kid is not going to partake in this. He's going to be bored at this celebration. And so, since the kid is going to be bored, we have to do something to occupy him, right? It's not about him relating or seeing how mommy or daddy relates to these other people or telling the stories. And that kid has a huge challenge, right? That kid has a huge challenge ahead of him because he now has entertainment or another way to be able to regulate his emotions at his fingertips.
Yes.
Technology is just like a substance in a lot of ways, right? I can go out and have a beer with some friends and it can be a really good thing, or I can be a raging alcoholic. And technology we're talking right now and we wouldn't have the chance to connect with each other without the means of technology. But at the same time, if I was never able to touch anyone, if I was never able to sit across from you at a table, or if I was only isolated to these environments, my my relationship skills, my ability to connect with people would be way different, right? And so I think there's challenges with both generations, and every generation has some unique ones. But what remains a consistent theme throughout these generations is that we have to be able to connect with others. And until we gain the capacity to ask good questions, to listen to each other, to be open to another person's perspective, to have empathy, we will always be limited by ourself and the way that we first grew up, which isn't always the best.
That's true. It's absolutely true. And yes, the technology, that's very sad. But reach out, you're right. I mean, the internet was a godsend in a sense during COVID where, people couldn't see each other. But the problem is now, like, people don't want to go back to work in an office. They don't want to see each other. They want to work from home. And I'm going, I I would not survive. So, like I said, I'm an introvert, extrovert, but I need to be around people at least at some point. And I remember my father once saying to me, he said, when you go to university, he says, unless you can be in the top 10, don't bother. He said, get your honors level, right? Which at that time was like 75, 80, right? And he said, and the rest of the time, learn your social skills, because when it comes to getting a job, unless you're in the not, if you're not in the top 10, your social skills are going to matter more than anything else when you
Mm,
go for a job interview, because they're going to be looking at and get everything, no matter what. I know, even if your computer, maybe not so much, but pretty well anything outside of that, being a computer programmer, is sales. It, it,
mm,
it's it's selling yourself, selling like sales is a weird word, but it's actually an overall one. I don't sell, but I'm selling an experience in a sense, right?
yeah.
So
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
people want to come back and see you again. So my dad was very, very big on that. He said, be good in your grades, but he says, but don't waste your time if you're not going to be in the top 10 studying and not being a part of a group or like a sports team or whatever. He says, hone your social skills. And I think
Yeah.
that sometimes the internet is not helping some of these young
Yeah.
people hone their social skills. But again, every generation is different, right? And I know my
Hmm.
my kids are really good. I mean, they're in their 30s. I still think of them as little kids, but like,
Mm,
um, and they've done very, very well. My daughter
mm.
is just wonderful at socializing. But I've seen other children that just the technology has just made them very a difficult thing. So, like you said, it's good and bad. And I'm blabbing on and everything. I might cut this part out because I'm talking too much, but just it just fascinates me. You go to a restaurant and there's like, um, there's a couple in front of each other and they're like this on their phone. You're going, why are you going out
Yeah.
to a restaurant? Stay home. Like,
Yeah, and the
oh
important
my
thing to
gosh.
remember is that we have to have examples, right? Like
Yeah.
it's really easy to look at like kids and people who grew up with technology and say, "Oh, it's like this, it's like that," but so much of it has to be taught, right? When I taught communication, we taught communication skills in my classroom. We would sit in a group, we would discuss an article, and there were things that I would grade them for. Hey, do you track the speaker? Do you look at who's talking? Do you use physical cues to show them that you're listening? Do you nod your head when they're talking? Right. Um, Another thing is, do you ask questions? Probably, I think the biggest challenge within a lot of generations and this includes older and newer generations, is the ability to ask questions, open-ended questions to gain insight. Did you ask anybody questions? Do you summarize other people's thoughts and ask for checks for understanding? Hey, I heard you saying this. Is that right? These are all social skills, and we only learn them through socializing and through other people. And unless we're intentional with it, then it's not going to be learned. It has to be taught by folks.
I was going to say that's a good one, intentionalizing. I know all of this. I still have a problem sometimes asking the questions. I have some good days and some bad days. And even meeting with someone and they're like with three other people. And of course, I'm delivering the card to that person. And they'll go, oh my goodness, I've been remiss in asking, who's with you? Like, because we tunnel vision things, right?
Hmm.
But that's
Yes.
a good point. Points I've been taught, but I haven't practiced, and you have to practice them. Please tell our listeners where they can find you.
Yeah. So if you want to learn more about me or some of the work that we're doing, you can go in two places. One is sandstonecare.com, and that does we do teen and young adult mental health and substance use treatment. So it's age specific, specifically designed for them. And to learn a lot of the things that we've been talking about here today, and to also work with the families of these parents, because hey, most parents are just doing the best that they can, right? And so we really want to support the whole biopsychosocial journey of everyone involved. And if you've been listening to my voice and you were like, yo, I want to hear more about this person or whatever, we have the Treatable podcast. It's available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. Each week, we take a different mental health challenge and we unpack it with an expert to show that change is possible, that all of the things that we go through are much more real and common and treatable than we sometimes realize. So, Treatable podcast and sandstonecare.com.
Thank you so much, Clint. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show. Really appreciate it. And amazing message. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was a pleasure talking with you. I feel like I learned a lot too, and I look forward to chatting again sometime soon.
Absolutely. Take care.
All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Be sure to visit me at bleepbulimia.com.